must thank you, first of all, because I'm Indian, and not many Americans are happy to hear non-Americans speak about America. In fact, you could say that not many Americans are prepared to tolerate non-Americans speaking about America. But this talk is really in a global context, because the US is still the world's largest economy, roughly a third, actually, of the world economy as a whole, and whatever happens here impacts the world. Second, my thanks, because I'm at this institute, which is hosted by St. Anselm's, while I am a Hindu follower of Jesus. And Hindu followers of Jesus tend to be very anti-Christian. So I'm particularly appreciative of St. Anselm's, which is prepared to tolerate someone like me who is otherwise quite critical of its allegiance. Now, though I may not be an ally, I'm certainly a co-belligerent, as I think you'll discover as we go along, a co-belligerent against many common opponents. The Relational Thinking Network, on whose behalf partly I'm speaking today, certainly has Roman Catholics among its members and supporters and sympathizers, along with Protestants, Eastern Orthodox Christians, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, people of other religions, as well as atheists and agnostics, and not to mention people who are to the left of the political spectrum, as well as to the right of the political spectrum. Allow me to start with a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, the well-known 19th century French observer of American society, whose book, Democracy in America, published in 1835, is still widely read. Indeed, if you haven't read it, I would recommend it to you as essential reading for anybody who claims to be intelligent and thoughtful in the United States today, or indeed actually anywhere in the world, because the United States has provided a sort of model for many other countries around the world. Tocqueville traveled through what was then the New World, observing, from the perspective of a detached social scientist, America's burgeoning democratic order, the market revolution, and of course Western expansion. The quote from Tocqueville, to which I want to draw your attention, is the following. There are many men of principle, he says, in both parties in America, but there is no party of principle. Perhaps some of you may feel that part of Tocqueville's statement, there is no party of principle in the US, is still valid. Others may feel differently. And I don't know, but perhaps some of you may feel that Tocqueville's statement, there are many men of principle in both parties, is less true than it used to be. If so, may I suggest that your gut feeling that the number of people of principle has declined may be partly due to your disappointment with some people who you thought were following good old American values, but turned out to have those on as a mask to hide their real motivations. And your gut feeling may possibly have partly something to do with your disappointment with some other people who may have really believed in those principles, but who made the wrong choice at one point or the other. But it's also possible that your gut feeling about the increasing lack of principles in today's politicians may be partly a mere perception. It may be that not all that many politicians lack principles. It may just be that they follow different principles from yours. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that there's been a colossal values shift among American politicians and indeed in American society in the generation or two since the 1960s, which I guess is the oldest that some of us around here are. That shift in US values was multi-dimensional. Allow me to attempt to describe some elements of it, even in the very brief time that we have together. Early US values could be considered to be an outcome of at least a three-way conflict. They were the values of the Native Americans, they were the values of those whom I may, without intending to indicate cattle ranching, and I hope not entirely inappropriately, colloquially called cowboys, and there were the values that ruled in the Puritan and other settlements that were indubitably Protestant, Reformed, Biblical, call them what you want. By the 19th century, when Tocqueville was traveling through America, it is clear that the influence of biblical values was widespread. So there was an impending clash with two new forces. The first and obvious clash was with the values of the slave-owning South, much of which justified its slave-owning by stray references to the Old Testament. But even though it required huge sacrifice to counter this threat, the threat of the slave-owning South, there was a far more insidious threat from the canker, the rot forming at the heart of Puritan and Protestant values in the settlements. The rising orientation, particularly among the rich, due to the inevitable temptation towards pride, arrogance, and a degenerate lifestyle, which led some of these people towards the philosophies of deism and rationalism. But at this stage in the 19th century, if one does not examine the philosophy, but examines the morality or ethics of these people who were deists and rationalists, you will find that they had an understandable emotional attachment, however nominal or superficial that may have been, to basically New Testament values, even if they had no real intellectual basis for such values in their own philosophy. As always happens, prosperity produces in the second and third generations of the wealthy an even greater tendency towards pride, arrogance, and a dissolute lifestyle. By the 1880s, deists and rationalists found New Testament morality far too constricting. And they started patronizing in more or less organized fashion the old idea of evolutionism in the modern avatar of evolutionism, which was of course at this stage Darwinism, to use that as a battering ram against organizations, institutions, and individuals that promoted trust in the Bible, faith in God, or anything like that. Now that attack was only marginally successful till the 1960s. When the GI Bill, and some of you are probably too young to remember the GI Bill, but when soldiers came back from the Second World War, the government put in place something called the GI Bill, as a result of which anybody who had served in the Army, Navy, or Air Force could go to university without charge, without cost. Fees would be paid and all that sort of thing. So all these thousands of returning soldiers now had to have provision in terms of university places. So not only were existing programs expanded, new institutions were created, so there was an incredible expansion of higher education in the United States, starting in the 50s, immediately after the end of the World War. And the expansion of institutions and programs provided to rationalists and evolutionists an opportunity to ensure that the academics in all these universities and programs were, as far as possible, rationalists and evolutionists. The 1960s and 70s, therefore, saw the culture-defining battle between faith and evolutionism, even though the wider body of outside universities and programs, seems to have been entirely unaware of that conflict, principally because they've been too preoccupied since the turn of the 20th century with trying to defend their own institutions, denominations, Bible schools, theological seminaries, churches, from the depredations of rationalism and evolutionism. So the picture, by the 1960s, had come to look something like this. The whole story is told much more fully in books such as Vishal Mangalwadi's The Book That Made Your World, or in George Marsden's The Soul of the American University, From Protestant Establishment to Established Non-Belief, and other works by Nathan O. Hatch, such as The Bible in America, The Democratization of American Christianity, and Methodism and the Shaping of American Culture. And probably most important of all, books by David Bevington, such as Baptists Through the Centuries and The Dominance of Evangelicalism. In any case, allow me to sum up the transition in American values down to our day in the following way. There have been incredible transformations of the dominant consensus in the US, which took us from no state establishment of any religious denomination, and therefore competition between the various varieties of Puritanism and Protestantism, to a new situation by the inclusion of Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics in the dominant consensus, so that the consensus was now called not no state establishment, but Christian. And from that there was a transition to the term Judeo-Christian by the inclusion of Jewish people in the United States from around the 1900s. We can argue exactly when it starts and when it becomes big, but certainly around the 1900s there are waves of Jewish people coming in, and so the dominant consensus shifts over to becoming Judeo-Christian. And from the 1960s there was a complete revolution towards what was called secular, when prayer started being banned in public schools, the Ten Commandments started being removed from public institutions and all that. And in the last few years, we have seen the prominence given by the media to anti-theists. The result has been the rise of what I call a whatever culture. And this whatever culture has three characteristics. First, the idea that there is no thing which is in its essence right or wrong, typified by the widespread propagandizing of the slogan, everything's relative. But it should be quite clear to anyone with the slightest bit of sense that everything is not relative. For instance, neither a mile, nor an acre, nor an inch, nor a pint, nor a gallon is relative. So the first mark of this whatever culture is the foolish idea that everything is relative. The second mark of this whatever culture is that the future does not matter. And this has, of course, implications when we look at how we're going to manage environmental challenges such as are around us here, not only around us in New Hampshire or in Boston or on the East Coast, but around the world. I was looking at the news regarding the United Kingdom this morning, and there are flood warnings, record-breaking flood warnings on the River Thames in London. And the discontent of the American people with the British government's ability to manage the fallout from weather events is such that we might see political change in the regime in the United Kingdom simply as a result of that. So the first mark of today's whatever culture is everything is relative. The second is the future does not matter. And the third is a sort of Buddhist attitude that the present is what it is and can be to you whatever you want it to be. People of my generation sometimes refer to this whatever culture as apathy. But it is rather a plague which has spread throughout the USA, a disease that would be called, in classical terms, the sin of spiritual sloth. Now, sloth has become a word which is practically unknown. Do I have something to scribble with? That is the word. And it's a word that has fallen out of the vocabulary, I'm afraid. But it's a word that's sort of fallen out of the vocabulary, but it was one of the 7 deadly sins. And what it consisted of was neglecting what God has said and being physically, emotionally, and volitionally inactive. The sin of sloth indicates waste due to lack of use, which concerns a person, a place, a thing, a skill, or even an ideal that would require maintenance, refinement, or support in order to continue to exist. But classical definitions of the sin of sloth focus on it as either refusal or carelessness in the performance of one's obligations, especially obligations which are spiritual, ethical, and legal, such as participating in a democracy. Political participation in a democracy would have been considered slothful, lack of political participation. Now, whether you consider it an America-wide plague of sloth or mere apathy, the result was that at the level of governance, we had the injection of high growth hormones into the economy. In the 1970s, the US committed the immoral act of delinking the dollar from gold, enabling first American debt due to the Vietnam War and all that. America had a huge foreign debt, enabling this debt to other countries to be repaid in debased dollars, dollars worth less than the value of the dollars when the money was borrowed. So that was the first reason for the delinking of the dollar from gold. You could pay your debts back in debased dollars. The second was so as to be able to manipulate the value of the dollar in the interests of American growth, but at the cost of increasing volatility and vulnerability, not only in the United States, but of course throughout the world. From the 1990s, as natural demand started drying up, our monetarist friends stimulated demand by artificial means, including putting in place particular mechanisms that were more or less effective, such as Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. But these sorts of mechanisms created the long-term challenges for the economy, which we have seen in the last few years. From the 1990s, demand picked up worldwide as a result of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the opening of Russia, China, and India, making the whole world capitalist, with 2.5 billion consumers and producers being added to the global economy, so that we would have had historically unprecedented growth anyway. But various ways were found of boosting that growth even further. Many of these ways were unsound and dangerous, which we look at in the next slide. But I just want to say before we move on to the next slide that any economy designed as ours is at present goes through booms and busts. And the greater the growth, the greater the likelihood of the bust when it comes being bigger. And since we've been through a historically unprecedented period of growth, the bust when it came was pretty unprecedented, and that's what started happening, of course, in 2007. So here are the other high growth hormones that were injected into the economy. I will start, if you don't mind, with the last one, high frequency trading. Now, you may not be very familiar with high frequency trading, but all it means is that if you own shares, you can trade them very quickly using computers and so on, and using automatic algorithms in computers, you can trade in milliseconds. It's very, 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 very high frequency trading, not just you sitting in front of a Schwab or whatever terminal or a connection and trading every morning, which you can do as well, of course. But this is high frequency trading in billions of dollars, which flies around the world all the time. Now, it's clear that the existence of high frequency trading is going to militate against long-term thinking on the part of companies, because of course they're going to be watching what their shares are doing, and the value of their shares is going to be impacted every millisecond by the algorithms and what they're doing. And it's clear that the existence of high frequency trading encourages the trend towards short-termism in our economy as a whole. So let me move then from high frequency trading to the encouragement of speculation. You know, of course, at least I hope you do, that the Great Depression of the 1930s led to a lot of academic study, which is now contested, and we can look at all the pros and cons of it. But the result of those academic studies was the putting in place of something called the Glass-Steagall Act. And the Glass-Steagall Act is, in principle, very simple to understand. And that was the following. You have money that you save that you put in a pension account. Well, at least those of you who are younger, I hope you put money in a pension account. But those of us who are older certainly put money in pension accounts. And those who are younger might have money in some kind of checking account. And one of the analyses was that too much gambling had been taking place with money of all sorts. And so we needed a sort of Chinese wall. We needed a sort of Chinese wall between the kinds of money you can gamble with, investment banking, and the kinds of money you can't gamble with. The kinds of money you can't gamble with is checking accounts, pension money, municipal money, etc. The kind of money you can gamble with is money that belongs to rich institutions, rich individuals who can actually afford to lose the money. You as an individual student can't afford to lose your money. You as an individual worker in a university or in a factory or something like that should not have your savings gambled with. And what started happening was that though the law existed, there was systematic subversion of the law in practice by collusion between market players, banks and so on, and administrators and regulators and politicians. So the law was systematically being violated for at least something like 20 years before the law was changed. And the law was changed on the grounds that market practice had now moved on. The market as a whole was doing whatever it was doing, and therefore the law needed to be changed to get in line with market practice. And so the Graham-Leach-Biley Act place in 1999, which said we don't need to worry about whose money is being gambled with. You can gamble with anybody's money because, you know, we've become more intelligent, you know, we've evolved. And because we've evolved and become more intelligent, we can now afford to gamble with everybody's money. And the result of gambling with everybody's money was, of course, you know, that whole countries have gone into bankruptcy, such as Iceland. There have been other countries which have been near the tip of bankruptcy, like Greece, which, had they not been rescued by the rest of the European Union, would have gone under. Portugal, Spain, and so on. You could name country after country. And in your own country, you had municipalities go bankrupt. Detroit is went bankrupt, and so on. So the utter stupidity of the change from the Glass-Steagall Act to the Graham-Leach-Biley Act should be self-evident. And it was because of that that, of course, new rules were put into place, known as the Dodd-Frank regulations. But even though they were put into place, if I recollect it right, 3 years ago, they have still not been implemented. So in fact, the market is operating according to Graham-Leach-Biley, even though the operating law, in fact, in theory, is the Dodd-Frank Act. This is the extent to which systematic violation of existing laws in the United States has gone on, and is going on. Another high-growth hormone that was added to the economy was so-called securitization. Now, securitization is such a comfortable word, isn't it? Now, if I told you that this building was going to be securitized, you would feel this good, isn't it? You feel this is a great thing to do. Yeah, I don't know what securitization is, but it sounds good. It must be okay. And so we had the securitization of loans, but what was meant by the securitization of loans was simply that loans were packaged and parceled and chopped up and divided very widely. The risk in them is divided very widely. And again, it does not require you to be super intelligent about economics to realize that if risk is being distributed very widely in a system, what it means is that the whole system is becoming risky. Depending, of course, on how much risk is being transferred. And the risk that was being transferred was several times global GDP. Depends on whose calculations you believe, but global GDP is the total value of goods and services produced around the world every year is something on the order of $50 billion. Something, depends which year and so on. Depends how debased the currencies become. Let's say $50 billion for the purpose of calculation. But the amount of risk that was being transferred through securitization was something of the order of $1.44 trillion. So if $1 billion was being distributed widely, that would probably not have been too bad. If $2 billion, maybe a little worse. $50 billion, maybe we needed to think about that. But 1.44 trillion was the amount of risk that was being securitized. And this happened because the attitude changed right through the political system, right through the economic system, right through the banking system, right through the financial system. Where's the risk? You're securitizing. Where's the risk? So we get to the top line, which is leverage. If you were an ordinary American, you could, of course, get mortgages worth 120% of the value of the property you were mortgaging, which is a little stupid, isn't it? But this was true not just if you were a reasonably well-paid American. This was true even if you were a very poorly paid American. And people who should never have had houses have been given houses. You know the story. But what you don't know is that though this kind of leverage applied to you and me as ordinary individuals, it also applied to the rich, who could now, using leverage, gamble with much more money than they even had. And so they could gamble in the millions. And big banks, such as the one I used to work for in Switzerland, could gamble in the billions through institutions like long-term credit management, LTCM, long-term credit management. And if you don't know the story, there's a very excitingly written book by a journalist, which is actually pretty factual, which tells you what happened in the case of LTCM. LTCM was set up by 2 Nobel Prize winners in economics. And they came to the top 8 banks, actually they went to a few more, but the others didn't agree. And they said to them, we will create a machine which will produce money for you in perpetuity, in vast amounts. And 8 banks were persuaded, by the way, including mine, were persuaded and became members of the LTCM conglomerate. In the first year, if I remember correctly, LTCM produced 21% returns from these banks. Not bad. In the second year, if I remember correctly, they produced 43% returns. Pretty good, eh? But in the third year, within 4 months, LTCM had collapsed. And not only had it collapsed so badly that it had brought the whole of the global economy to the brink of collapse. And it required 3 eminent American gentlemen to get together and to resolve to do completely illegal things in order to save the global economy. And the completely illegal things were the following. If my bank, for example, which had given $1 billion to LTCM, and other banks had given 2.3, or one I think was the minimum and the maximum was something of the order of $2.3 billion. The 3 gentlemen rang up the chief executive and said, you put $1 billion in? Yes. And you know, of course, that's gone. Yes. Now, the bad news is that unless we do something about it, the whole of the global economy is going down. Yeah, we can see that. So what do you suggest be done? Well, our suggestion is that since you put in $1 billion in the first place into LTCM, you put in another $1 billion now to save the global economy. And if the choice is between saving the global economy and doing something, being asked to do something completely illegal, you probably will do something which is completely illegal. And so the banks coughed up the money, the global economy was saved, and it was half an hour away from global collapse. That is the story of LTCM. Well, all these kinds of high growth hormones led to the current economic crisis, which started in 2007, and from an economic point of view, of course, the crisis is over long ago. But in reality, as we know, the crisis is not over, whether for companies or for investors or for workers. The real world is unfortunately a different world from the world of economics and finance. And this gap between the real world and financial world has increased and increased over this period as a result of the governance changes in values that we're talking about. Leading, of course, to the current political deadlock. And the political deadlock is, of course, not one of policies, even though that is the appearance given to the deadlock, because it suits both Democrats and Republicans to present it as such. Rather, the political deadlock is really a gridlock of interests. We don't have time to explore that further right now, but if you're interested in looking further into that matter, there are plenty of books which will provide you with facts, such as this one, Jeff Bowes' Global Class War, which documents how America's bipartisan elite has betrayed the people of the United States. In any case, in view of our topic today, the point to which I want to draw your attention is the following. Politics always trumps economics, said my economics professor to me when I was 16 and at university. Almost, it was not my first lecture, but it was one of my first lectures. And I did not understand what he was saying. Politics trumps economics. But by the time I graduated from university, some of my fellow graduates were no longer happy to work in India because they found better opportunities outside India. And so the first generation of brain drain from India started around the time that I graduated from university. And a few years later, it was evident that these people who'd gone abroad were doing very well for themselves, thank you. Today, of course, as you know, 13 of the global corporations are run by Indians. 4 of them graduates of my college, my generation. So the point is that just a few years after I graduated, I began to see that the guys who went through university with me were doing very well abroad. They were not necessarily more intelligent than I was, or more hardworking, or imaginative, or creative, or any of these things than I was. But they were doing far better than me. And then it began to occur to me. Politics got the wrong political system, it doesn't matter how intelligent you are, it doesn't matter how hard you work, it doesn't matter how imaginative, creative you are, your country's going to have problems. You got the politics right, pretty stupid people can do all right. In Switzerland, where I live, the average cleaner, who is usually a foreigner, usually illiterate, earns enough to have 2 holidays a year. Politics always trumps economics, something I did not understand at that stage. Then I began to understand a bit more of it. The second thing, which took even longer for me to understand, and I'm not sure I understand it fully at the moment, is that political renewal requires cultural renewal. And political renewal and cultural renewal, of course, go hand in hand. You've got the right kind of political leadership, and it can encourage cultural renewal. You want examples of that? You can look at Singapore. You can look at what's happening in Rwanda right now. Many countries around the world where political leadership, with the right values, can encourage cultural renewal. But you can also have examples where cultural renewal then leads to political renewal. Lots of examples of those. I guess the most outstanding example of this is Victorian England, where William Wilberforce, some of you know his work, William Wilberforce and his friends took what was then the most corrupt country in the world, the United Kingdom, where you to buy your way into being an officer, bribe your way to being an officer in the Navy or Army or not Air Force, of course, Navy or Army, where you had to drive your way into Parliament. You think American politics is bad at the moment? Not compared to Victorian England or pre-Victorian England. You had to even buy your way into becoming a priest. Because once you became a priest, you had a salary, you had a living. You could survive. Buy your way into becoming a priest. That's how corrupt the country was. And in one generation, Wilberforce and his friends, at no stage more than 15 of them, took the country from being one of the most corrupt countries in the world into being one of the cleanest countries in the world. They had transformed the United Kingdom. It's a story that's not often told. The story that is told is that Wilberforce and his friends succeeded in abolishing slavery. That's the story that's true. And it's true. They did succeed in abolishing slavery. 40 years or whatever before the United States did. But to my mind, a far more impressive achievement was cleaning up their own country. And for cultural renewal, I suggest you, relational thinking has much to offer anybody, whether they're ordinary Democrats or Republicans or uncommitted citizens. And what I think that relational thinking has to offer, I'm sorry that it's not very clear, but if I start at the top over there, that represents finance and economy. So, you know, of course, that our financial system is based on debt. You know that it's highly short-termist, we just mentioned it, we talked about it, and it's, of course, focused on GDP. If you go over to the government sector, you can see that government is highly interventionist, it is bureaucratized, and it's centralized. If you go over to our justice system, you can see that our justice system is outsourced, partly because of our financial system. It's outsourced, it's impersonal, and it's punitive. And you can see that all these things are interconnected. We obviously don't have time to look at this in detail, but I'll send the slides to you if you like, or Simon can send the slides to you, and then you can study it and look at it. So one of the things that relational thinking does, I think, is that it enables us to have a comprehensive view of the interconnectedness of the problems. The second thing that it enables you to do is that it offers us a comprehensive vision for the future. I'm not sure how clear that is, but there too, you can see that if we want to, we could have a system, which is what relational thinking recommends. It's called a biblical model, because it originally came from the Bible, but you don't have to be a Bible believer to accept it. You can be any humanist or rationalist or deist or whatever else, because it's actually just good sense. Is it possible for the finance and financial and economic world to be built on partnership and on equity rather than on debt? Could it be built on shared risk? Could it be sustainable? And in this vision, it's possible to do that. Could government be distributed and local? Could it have a facilitating role rather than a bureaucratic interventionist role? Could the justice system be collaborative, community-based, and restorative rather than punitive? And so on. You can see that it is an interconnected vision of society looking at all aspects of life. And if it was really to be put in place, then of course there would be certain changes that we could think about, and the changes would be that we would go from having an economy which damages relationships, which is what our economy does at the moment. The Harvard professor, a very famous Harvard professor called Stephen Marglin, who published a book a few years ago titled The Dismal Science, How Thinking like an Economist Damages Community. And it's interesting that on a television interview with me in Switzerland, I invited him to Switzerland, when I asked him, does it only damage community or does it also damage family? He said, well, yes it does. And does it only damage families or does it damage companies? What about that a little more? He said, yes, it does. I said, what about nations? Does thinking like an economist damage nations? And that took him a little longer to think about. He said, yes, thinking like an economist also damages nations. Harvard economist, not a left-wing lunatic from Moscow. And so we can work our way through the circle and we can see that the world would look very different if this kind of a model was in fact put in place. Now, applying the relational model to your family, which you can also do, to your personal relationships, which you can also do, or to voluntary organizations, or to St. Anselm's, or whatever else, can also be done. And if you were to do that, then you would begin to see how relationships can actually be improved in every aspect of your personal life, your family life, your voluntary life, if you see what I mean, or your institutional life. Relational thinking is in fact buttressed by solid academic research through the non-profit organizational relational research, which is able to undertake research on behalf of think tanks or non-profits or foundations, or indeed political parties or governments, companies, and so on. And there is a for-profit company, Relational Analytics. Though a part of its profits go to investors in the company, they are aware that a part of the profits also go back into the work of relational research. And Relational Analytics offers a set of audit tools for companies, not only to measure relational risk, but also as a consequence of the audit to prescribe ways of addressing relational risk inside companies. Between the specialist parts of the relational thinking network and the national movements, such as the USA's own Our World, which was inaugurated only 2 weeks ago, Simon, the executive director of Our World, is here. And if you have questions about the national movement, which has just started, as I said, please contact him. And Professor Kuehne is, of course, very much connected with it. So if you want to ask him questions, I'm sure he'll be happy to do that. So between the national movements, which are not only in the USA, but also in the UK, where the movement started, South Africa, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, and the specialist parts of the relational thinking network, such as relational research and relational analytics, the relational thinking network offers you one important means of cultural renewal, which I'm happy to commend to you. Naturally, there are other organizations also working for societal resurgence, and you may perhaps already be working with them. And if so, that's great. I certainly hope so. Meanwhile, let me summarize my message. Governance has become more and more unethical since the 1980s because of the increasing abandonment by Americans of truth and spirituality that lead to morality and responsibility. The route to cultural renewal, the route to social, economic, and political recovery undoubtedly lie in recommitment to the concept of truth, to morality, and to responsibility by each of us in this room, as well as by the many millions of Americans around this nation. If you do not turn to truth, morality, and responsibility, then America as a nation will continue to decay. only rise, as the US has since about 1900, 1880, nations have also fallen into decline and oblivion. Think of the Roman Empire, you can think of the Greek Empire, you can think of the Assyrian Empire, you can think of Genghis Khan. In history, nations rise and fall, and we know that they rise and fall for various reasons, but the reason why the US rose, we know and understand, and the reasons why the US will fall, if it falls, are also clear. But I'm hopeful that a better prospect is ahead, and that we and others in the USA will turn to truth, goodness, mercy, and indeed to genuine and sacrificial love for each other, for your nation, and for the still globalizing world.